Hello, BookTube. Welcome back to AusBooks, where I'm talking about some random Australian books I own, and we're moving on from the very lovely Henry Kendall, who I talked about yesterday and done like a very lovely Poetry Thursday video on, to we're talking about a very brutal novel, The Broad Arrow, by Carolyn Womler Lanky, whatever. This was published in 1859. It's a very interesting early convict novel. It's one of the first books to genuinely describe the Australian colonial system at the time, and really, I think the only early novel that has a woman as the main character because the main girl is a female convict. And it's just a very interesting novel, and I can't wait to talk about it. So, a bit of background for Carolyn. Who was she? Well, she was born in England, but traveled to Tasmania for a bit in like 1847. She stayed until 1853, where she left when she was 20 because she was sick and ill. But she came back to London, released a volume of poetry she wrote in Tasmania, which didn't do that much. And I haven't read it because I can't find it to save my life. And 5 years later, she published this novel, and it would be the only novel she would publish. But it took off, and I'm going to tell you a bit about it now. So we follow a 16-year-old girl named Medea, I think that's how you say it, Maida, and she's at like a border school for girls and all that stuff. And she has a brief relationship with a young officer. I forget his name, but I've got it written down here somewhere. But we'll worry about it when we get to it. And turns out she gives birth to their unplanned baby, and the officer abandons her, and the main girl is forced to live in pure poverty for the next 3 years. And there's also some stuff that the officer does that takes advantage of this too, which we'll get to. But I kind of want to spoil because it kind of what makes the book. But anyway, after 3 years in just pure poverty, the baby dies, and the main girl's like, "Oh, I've got to go to the bush to bury it because what do I do with this baby corpse?" Pretty much, and she goes to the bush to start digging a hole for the infant, and not the infant, sorry, for the baby. 3 year old. But anyway, while she's doing that, she gets arrested for infanticide, and obviously for murder, and she gets sentenced to death. She gets was about to be sentenced to being hanged, but the officer man comes in and is like, the young man's like, no, why don't we just send her off to Tasmania, pretty much. And that's what happens. So she doesn't get the death penalty in the end, and so she travels to Tasmania to serve her sentence. Where she gets there, she works as like a domestic servant for a very important family, and that's kind of like the main setup for what's going on, because there's two parts to this novel. Because the first half is following Medea, whatever her name is, Medea, the main girl, as she is like a literal convict, and just what slice of life, what's it like with the family who are controlling, a lot of very social awareness stuff going on, which I'll talk about soon. Then the other half of the novel is following that officer's family, chaotic family life, and towards the end of the novel, they like kind of cross paths at a certain point, but it doesn't happen at the end. It's a very weird novel, but in all honesty, the plot is very melodramatic. It's a tough recommend because the plot itself is fine, I guess. It's very early on to another Australian novel, which we'll hopefully be talking about soon, which is For the Term of His Natural Life by Marcus Clarke, which will come out later, obviously, but this is a very, very similar novel. It's Marcus did, I think he did say that he borrowed a lot of inspiration from this novel to write his own, and obviously that book's gone on to live its own life and everything, but where the Broad Arrow has kind of been lost to time. But yeah, what makes this book so interesting is that Carolyn goes into so much detail about the time period this novel was set in, because only 6 years prior to this novel's publication, Tasmania stopped accepting convicts. So this was very, very a perfect snapshot for the time period. We're talking about the social dynamics, the judgment and the punishments that the colonies would have, and the men that are in the chain gangs and all that, and laborers, and like all the women that end up being servants, and some of them later on into nurses. It's very interesting. It's like a really good snapshot of that time, but again, it is very preachy at times. But I kind of liked it, to be honest. Again, it's a bit of a hard rack, but I think if you want to do like a novel that really talks about a lot of the social issues of the time of early Australia, this is probably one of the best we've talked about so far. I would say this, and I can't remember who I've talked about now. It's blanking, but you can have a look through at some of the novels, unless you want to do like a non-fiction account, which we've talked about a lot so far. This is probably one of the best when it comes to fiction about early Australian history. But yeah, this book, The Broad Arrow, which is also a reference to the brand that, the actual brand that convicts would get to, identify them later on and all that stuff. But yeah, this is very much this book to walk so Marcus Clark could run later on. And I do think For the Term of His Natural Life is the better novel. This one's not as just bleak, but it does have its moments, definitely. Again, when it comes to the main girl living her life, witnessing a lot of brutality, which I think is really interesting to read about. And I'm pretty much ranting now because there's not that much because the plot's kind of fine, very melodramatic, but the details, the crumbs that Carolyn left in these books, this book at least, is very interesting if you like your Australian history. But yeah, that's your AusBook for today. The Broad Arrow. Again, this is actually in print still because for the longest time, it's probably a big book, like 400-ish pages. It was heavily abridged at a certain point, but in 2019 it got a big paperback reprint with the original text. I'm not sure if it's on Gutenberg. You probably can find it there. It's prehistorically old at this point. And yeah, if I ever find a copy, I'd probably pick it up and give it another reread. But yeah, that's your AusBook. Have you read The Broad Arrow? Let me know what you think about it. And yeah, thank you so much for watching BookTube, and I will see you next time.